Redditor 1. I recall being 7 when I first witnessed them breach my wall, though that's not entirely precise, as it was the earliest memory I have of them crossing over. That subtle distinction matters, for so much about those nights exists in a blurred state between recollection and terror, between what I know occurred and what my mind protests as impossible. Yet, the memory of that initial encounter remains as clear as the moments before a catastrophic crash or the final second before a fall. My bedroom was on the second floor of our ordinary suburban home in Vermont. Nothing remarkable, with its pale blue walls, a ceiling peppered with glow-in-the-dark stars, and a bookshelf laden with Goosebumps novels and science encyclopedias. The east-facing window offered a view of our backyard maple, and beyond that, endless woods. Even as a child prone to anxiety, lying awake long after lights out, tracking shifting shadows on my ceiling and imagining hidden figures in my closet, this night was different. The fear that gripped me wasn't conjured by my imagination. It arose from something deep, primal, as if my body sensed a truth my mind had yet to comprehend. It started with a peculiar pressure in my ears, reminiscent of the sensation you get when climbing a steep hill. Then, the air around me altered, thickening with a charged, static energy that made every hair on my arms stand up. My digital clock flickered. 3:17 a.m. Frozen under my Star Wars blanket, I tried to simultaneously monitor every inch of my room, the walls, the ceiling, the closet door, the window, with eyes darting in a pattern that would later become second nature. And then I saw it. The wall next to my dresser rippled, much like the concentric waves created by a stone dropped into a pond, but in a vertical plane. In the center of these ripples, something began to force its way through. They were small, roughly 3 feet tall, with such slender frames that their oversized heads seemed impossible to support. Their skin wasn't like flesh at all. It resembled a smooth, featureless modeling clay. No wrinkles, pores, or any hint of muscle, just an even, malleable gray. Yet, it was their eyes that have haunted me since. Not the typical dark oval orbs of movies or comics, but eyes that wrapped around the sides of their heads like those of a wasp. Detached, emotionless, simply there to observe and record, void of any apparent intent. That night, 3 of them emerged. They moved with an eerie precision, like automatons on a production line, without a trace of personality. Their long, spindly fingers reached for my wrist. Their touch was neither warm nor cold, only unmistakably present. I couldn't scream. I was paralyzed by terror, my throat locked and my muscles turned to stone. They guided me through the wall, a sensation akin to passing through a cool, dry membrane, as if wading through water, and into another space entirely. The room they brought me into was stark and featureless. Smooth walls that swallowed light instead of reflecting it, no doors or windows, just a platform that might have been a table or a part of the floor that had risen to meet me. One of them ran its impossibly long fingers up my spine, moving over each vertebra like counting beads on a rosary. That's when she appeared. She was markedly different, taller, perhaps around 6 feet, with more defined yet still otherworldly features. While the smaller ones resembled mindless drones, she exuded a presence and will that was palpable. When her insectoid eyes, uncannily reminiscent of a wasp, met mine, I felt her consciousness invade my thoughts. It was like trying to swim upstream in a raging current. She didn't simply read my mind, she rearranged it, planting new thoughts as if sowing seeds in fertile soil. Her silent message echoed within me, "We are grateful for your help. You are invaluable to our project." I wanted to demand answers, to scream for my parents, to wake from what must have been a nightmare. But her will smothered my thoughts like a heavy blanket before they could form. "Do not reveal our existence," she continued, "for they cannot see us, and they will only be frightened." She tried to make it sound like praise, as if I were special, chosen, like a student commended for cleaning the classroom board. But I never desired that attention. I only longed to return to the safety of my bed beneath my Star Wars blanket. Then she spoke words that would haunt me for years. "Limit your trash. Excess leads to sickness. Cease the felling of trees." It wasn't the message alone that disturbed me, but the implication behind it. These beings, whatever they truly were, weren't merely studying us. They cared, in a way, about our self-destruction and the harm we were inflicting upon our planet. The very thought that something so alien could be worried about humanity was more terrifying than any intrusion. That first encounter set the pattern for many subsequent visits, sometimes weekly, sometimes with months in between, always beginning with that ear pressure and charged air, always with the small ones first and then her, and always with that overwhelming sense of violation when she entered my mind. I devised methods to cope, lying awake for hours, straining to watch every surface simultaneously, driving myself to exhaustion in the vain hope that deep sleep might shield me. It never worked. Their visits continued throughout my childhood and into my early teens. They left no visible scars, no implants, no recorded lost time, only memories, lingering fear, and the crushing burden of knowing something no one would believe. At age 11, I discovered a book on alien abductions in the library. Reading it was like uncovering the key to a door I hadn't known was locked. It confirmed that others, too, had encountered these small gray beings, and the taller one with a mind-probing ability, that they could pass through solid matter, and that they possessed a disturbing concern for our environment. For 3 days I was numb with shock, relieved to know I wasn't alone, yet terrified that nowhere was truly safe. Walls and locks meant nothing to them. As a teenager, I delved into research on alien abduction accounts. I learned to instantly discern which stories were genuine and which were fabricated. True accounts never depicted the grays with human-like features. No wrinkles, no visible muscles, no expressions. They were described simply as they were. Efficient biological machines executing inexplicable tasks for reasons beyond our understanding. Their visits ended as abruptly as they began when I turned 15, but the effects lingered. I developed what some now term post-abduction disorder, a term you won't find in any official manual. Even now, I cannot sleep without checking every corner of my room, nor can I tolerate needles. They terrify me, as do certain insects, particularly wasps with their alien watchful eyes. In my 20s, I sought therapy for depression. During one intense session, I finally recounted those nights in full detail. I shook so violently that my therapist had to guide me through deep breathing before I could leave. I understand how this might sound. If someone else read my account, they'd likely dismiss it as sleep paralysis, night terrors, or an overactive imagination fueled by too many science fiction books, perhaps even a manifestation of childhood trauma. Yet, I know what I experienced. Unlike sleep paralysis, which fades upon waking, these memories remain sharp and present. The sensation of those long fingers on my spine, her overwhelming presence invading my mind, and the way the wall rippled like water remain indelible. I no longer believe they were extraterrestrials in the traditional sense. The impossibility of faster-than-light travel makes that unlikely. Sometimes I think they were interdimensional beings, slipping between layers of reality, or perhaps manifestations of our collective unconscious, given form by our shared fears and guilt over how we treat our world. Yet most nights, I try not to dwell on what they might truly be, for any explanation seems woefully inadequate. How does one rationalize an experience that lies beyond the boundaries of possibility? Now, at 42, I have built a life that many would call normal, a successful career, a loving partner, yet I still feel that pressure in my ears late at night, still sense the static in the air, still scan the walls, waiting for that familiar ripple. My partner dismisses it as mere light sleeping, never understanding why I inspect every corner of our bedroom, or why I sometimes awaken at precisely 3:17 a.m., eyes frantically shifting among walls, ceilings, and closet doors. Just last week, I saw a wasp constructing a nest beneath our eaves. Its precise mechanical movements sent a shiver down my spine, and for a moment I was transported back to when I was 7, feeling those long alien fingers on my wrist and hearing her voice echo in my mind. I've never fully recounted this story, not even to my therapist, who only caught fragments. I'm not interested in UFO conventions or government cover-ups. I only know what happened to me and what continues to haunt my nightmares. Sometimes I wonder about the other children they visited, if they too lie awake at night, haunted by memories of cold touches and invasive thoughts. And in my darkest moments, I question whether her concern for our environment, our trash, our deforestation, was justified. Perhaps the true horror isn't in their visitations, but in the fact that they had a reason to be worried about us. Because those all-encompassing insect-like eyes saw everything, and what they saw compelled them to reach across the gulf between our worlds, to leave warnings in our minds like seeds. I still keep my childhood Star Wars blanket, carefully preserved in a cedar chest in our attic. Sometimes, I trace its faded patterns with my fingers, recalling how it failed to protect me on those nights when the walls rippled like water. And sometimes, late at night, when the house is silent and the air thick with possibility, I find myself hoping they'll return. Not because I long to relive the terror, but because now I have questions. Questions about why they chose me, about the nature of their project, about whether they continue to watch as we self-destruct. Above all, I hope they come back, for the alternative, being abandoned entirely, is far worse. Even as I write this, the clock on my nightstand reads 3:16 a.m. The air is heavy, my ears are popping, and the wall beside my dresser, is it my imagination or did it just ripple once more? Editor 2. Growing up as the daughter of an experimental flight test engineer at Edwards Air Force Base made my childhood entirely unique. While other kids drifted off to bedtime stories of princesses and dragons, I fell asleep listening to tales of breaking the sound barrier and watching experimental aircraft slice through the desert sky. Yet there was one story my father never meant for me to hear, a secret that slipped out one late night when the whiskey had loosened his tongue. I was home from college for the weekend, sitting with him on our back porch in Lancaster. The night was clear and the distant glow from the base punctuated the dark horizon. Though he had retired 3 years earlier, his eyes still wandered toward Edwards with a lingering nostalgia. "Remember all those times I took you out to the dry lake beds?" he asked, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. I nodded, recalling those special days of watching test flights from safe distances and examining relics scattered across the barren ground like archaeological treasures from a grander time. He continued, "The rocket rail was always your favorite, but there was one night in '97, something happened out there that wasn't part of any test plan." This was a tale he'd never shared before. I leaned forward, watching his face as it grew grave and serious. We were running night tests on a new prototype. I can't reveal what it was since it's still classified, but it was unlike anything we'd ever encountered. The design was so unconventional that some engineers joked it looked more alien than human. Taking another sip of whiskey, he said, "That night, the conditions were perfect. Clear skies, no moon, minimal civilian air traffic. The test pilot, James Mitchell, a fine man who had flown in Desert Storm, was set for his first full-speed run. Everything was normal until we reached test altitude. Then, the sensor readings went haywire. The craft began executing maneuvers that defied logic, forces that should have been fatal. Mitchell's radio went dead." His hands trembled as he recalled. "And then we saw the lights, 3 bright points, moving in formation with our prototype. They hadn't appeared on the radar or triggered any detection system. They just materialized. The craft began mirroring their movements exactly, like a perfect reflection. When we eventually regained radio contact, Mitchell wasn't himself. He kept reciting coordinates in a voice that sounded almost otherworldly. Those coordinates pointed to a small, unused dry lake bed. For 12 minutes, all tracking data vanished. When the systems rebooted, the prototype was sitting on the lake bed, cold to the touch, with Mitchell unconscious in the cockpit. When he came to, he had no memory of the landing." He paused, the weight of the memory evident in his silence. "The next day, the project was scrubbed entirely, all data erased, all materials disposed of. Mitchell retired early and moved to Alaska. Officially, nothing was ever acknowledged. But that wasn't the strangest part." He lowered his voice further. "A week later, while reviewing footage from our perimeter cameras, I discovered a 12-minute gap. When I paused on the last frame before the gap, I saw something chilling." He pulled out his phone to show me a grainy still of security camera image. At first glance, it showed nothing but the dark expanse of the dry lake bed. Then, subtle patterns emerged. A perfect circle about half a mile across, filled with intricate, shifting geometric designs. That pattern wasn't there the next day, he said softly. Yet, every few years, pilots report failures in their instruments over that exact spot. Compasses spinning, radios dead, GPS failing, and sometimes, if you're out there at night. He trailed off, leaving me to wonder. What happened? I pressed. Sometimes you see lights on the lake bed, like something drawing those precise patterns with laser-like accuracy from beneath the surface. The brass dismiss it as atmospheric phenomena or tests of new ground illumination systems. But I know every project that ever came through Edwards. No illumination system could do what I saw. He continued, after that night I dug into old records. I found incidents dating back to the 1,950 experimental aircraft encountering inexplicable phenomena during night tests. Pilots reported impossible maneuvers by unidentified craft, and mysterious patterns appeared on the lake beds, only to vanish again. Ever heard how some say the F-117 Nighthawk generated UFO reports during its tests in Palmdale? Sometimes I wonder if we designed it that way, to mimic something we once saw out there. My father poured himself another measure, but didn't drink. I retired early because I couldn't keep pretending everything was normal after knowing what I knew. Some of those experimental planes we developed, perhaps we weren't the only ones experimenting. He made me promise never to share his story. Yet just last week, while driving past Edwards on a dark night, I took a detour near that abandoned dry lake bed. My GPS went haywire as I neared, and through my windshield I saw lights dancing over the bed, tracing patterns with an inner rhythm that defied explanation. I turned around quickly, but in my rearview mirror I swear I saw something rising from the lake bed, a shape eerily reminiscent of the prototype from my father's tale, but unmistakably not one of ours. My father passed away last year, taking most of his secrets with him. Still, on clear nights, I sit on my porch, watching the distant glow over Edwards, wondering how many experimental crafts are truly ours, and how many are merely us trying to catch up with something already beyond us. A silent dance of lights amid the desert dust that holds more secrets than we're ready to comprehend. Redditor 3. The most harrowing part isn't the nightmares themselves, nor is it the missing time or the strange lights I sometimes glimpse at the edge of my vision. It's that I once had actual, physical proof, and I let it vanish down a bathroom drain when I was 12. I've never shared this story on social media or UFO forums. Who would believe me? But lately, the dreams have grown more intense, and I must document it, if only to convince myself I'm not losing my mind. It began with a persistent itch in my left earlobe. Nothing dramatic at first, just a mild irritation that led me to scratch it during dinner. My mother, noticing, assumed it was an earring infection, despite me never having been pierced. A week later, I felt something solid beneath the skin, a hard, round object I could roll slightly under my touch, like a tiny ball bearing trapped just below the surface. My mother dismissed it as a pimple or a cyst, insisting it was perfectly normal for someone my age. But I knew this was different. Even the school nurse confirmed it was just a small pimple, suggesting tea tree oil. Yet pimples don't feel metallic, nor do they seem to pulse in time with your heartbeat as you try to sleep. For 6 long months, that object remained, a constant presence that kept me awake at night, as I lay there aware of it while strange lights flickered outside my window, and I awoke with my pajamas inexplicably jumbled. Then the dreams began, if they could even be called dreams. I'd see myself lying on something cold and flat, under bright lights, with elusive shadows dancing just at the edge of my vision. A high-pitched electronic hum filled the air, followed by a sensation in my ear as if something was being inserted with meticulous precision. I'd wake up tangled in my sheets, heart racing with that object thumping in time with my pulse. After 6 agonizing months, I reached my breaking point. One Saturday morning, with my parents out shopping, I resolved to remove it myself. a decision I now recognize as both foolish and dangerous, though at 12, one feels invincible. I gathered my makeshift tools, a sewing needle, rubbing alcohol, cotton balls, and my mother's hand mirror. Locking myself in the bathroom, I sterilized everything as best as I could, relying on what I'd seen on medical shows. The needle pierced my earlobe, pain and blood erupting immediately, yet the pain was eclipsed by my determination to extract the object. I felt it sliding beneath my skin toward the incision I'd made, and with a firm squeeze, I forced it upward. It popped out, nearly slipping from my grasp, rolling across my palm and leaving a tiny trail of red. It was a flawless sphere, smaller than a BB, fashioned from a black metal unlike anything I'd seen. Its surface dimpled uniformly with a subtle indentation around its middle, reminiscent of an equator. My trembling hands held it up to the light. It absorbed the light rather than reflecting it and radiated a warmth that seemed to come from within. I placed it on the sink's edge to wipe away some blood. Then, inexplicably, the sphere began to roll on its own, tracing 2 perfect circles around the sink before disappearing down the drain with a quiet plunk. I screamed in frustration and plunged my hand into the drain, but it was gone. When my parents returned, they found me on the bathroom floor, crying, with blood on my hands and shirt. I tried to explain, but they were too angry at my reckless stunt to listen. My father simply cleaned my ear, while my mother lectured me about not picking at pimples with needles. That was 15 years ago. The nightmares eventually subsided, and the strange lights became less frequent. I graduated, went to college, started a career, life went on normally. Yet, I've never stopped wondering about the proof I lost down that drain. Just last month, I experienced an itch in my right earlobe. When I pressed it, I felt another hard, round object beneath the skin. I immediately made an appointment with a doctor. An X-ray revealed nothing, and the doctor dismissed it as a cyst. But last night, I saw those peculiar lights again outside my window, and this morning I discovered my pajamas were inexplicably on inside out. This time, I won't try to remove it myself. I've prepared a powerful magnet, a glass jar, and even installed cameras in my bedroom. Whatever is happening to me, I refuse to let that evidence slip away again. Yet sometimes late at night, I swear I can still sense that first implant somewhere in the sewers, sending silent signals into the dark. And I can't help but wonder, what if it isn't trying to communicate with something above us, but rather reaching out to something below? P.S. If you ever feel something similar under your skin, please see a doctor. Get scans, document everything, and do not risk self-surgery like I did. Redditor 4. A small, dark spot first emerged on my thigh in early March. Just a tiny freckle against my pale skin that I initially dismissed as another sign of aging, like the gray hairs or the creaking of my knees on stairs. But freckles don't change, and this one did. By May, the spot had developed a strange central depression, reminiscent of a miniature volcanic crater. The surrounding skin also felt altered, firmer, almost waxy. I found myself absent-mindedly running my fingers over it during meetings and while watching TV, growing increasingly aware of its persistent presence. I'd experienced skin issues before, teenage acne, the occasional cyst, but this was different. When I pressed around it, I could feel something solid underneath, like a tiny ball bearing lodged beneath the surface. Though my rational mind urged me to schedule a dermatologist visit, the 3-month waiting list and an inexplicable sense of unease held me back. The spot felt wrong, foreign, as though it didn't belong on my body. One restless night, after hours of tossing and turning because I could feel it pressing against my pajama pants, I finally broke. I told myself I was only going to examine it closely, maybe even clean the area, but I was deceiving myself. I had everything prepped in advance: sterilized tweezers, boiled thoroughly, antiseptic wipes, gauze, bandages. Under the harsh bathroom light, I examined the spot in the mirror. Had it grown? The indentation seemed deeper than before. When I pressed the skin surrounding it, I sensed something shift underneath, not in the fluid manner of a cyst, but in a deliberate, solid way, as though whatever lay beneath was adjusting its position. The initial squeeze was more painful than expected, a deep, burning sensation that radiated up my leg. And then I saw it, something dark and perfectly round, emerging as I squeezed, pushing through the thin layer of skin. My hands trembled as I grasped it with the cold metal of the tweezers. At first, I thought it might be a tick, but ticks have legs and defined features. This was a flawless sphere, smooth, reflective, and seemingly absorbing light rather than reflecting it. I carefully placed it into a small glass vial I'd repurposed from my sister's bead collection. My skin began to bleed, though not excessively. The wound was strangely clean, almost surgical. While cleaning up, I could have sworn the sphere shifted slightly within the vial, a subtle rotation that nearly caused me to drop it. I secured the cap and set it on the counter. Then I noticed something on my other thigh, about 6 inches above my knee. A tiny, dark freckle, much like the first. Now, as I write, that sphere sits on my desk, sealed within its glass prison. Sometimes in the quiet of the room, I think I hear a faint, high-pitched frequency at the edge of hearing, and occasionally, if I catch it out of the corner of my eye, it appears to be oriented differently than when I left it. I know I should take it to a doctor to have it analyzed, tested, studied, but each time I consider it, that eerie frequency seems to intensify, and an inexplicable reluctance seizes me. Maybe tomorrow I'll finally have it examined, but for now, I simply watch it. And sometimes I'm convinced it watches me in return. P.S. If you discover a similar spot on your skin, please consult a professional. I'm beginning to wonder, what if it wasn't trying to extricate itself, but merely relocating? Redditor 5. Summer nights in Utah's mountains have a way of making you feel minuscule. I learned that lesson in 2012 when I was 16 and believed I had it all figured out. Now, a decade later, I'm far less certain, especially about what transpired that night near Springville. There were 4 of us, myself, Jake, Marcus, and Chris. We had been camping in these mountains since childhood, usually with our families, but this was our first trip on our own, just 4 teenagers, a canvas tent, and enough junk food to survive a catastrophe. We felt invincible. Our tent was Jake's father's old army surplus, a thick canvas structure that blocked even the brightest stars. We set it up in a secluded clearing about 2 miles above the valley, far enough from the trail to avoid other hikers, a perfect hideout for 4 high school sophomores. After an hour spent inside, devouring Doritos and chatting about trivialities, Marcus fell suddenly silent. Through the heavy canvas, we noticed a light, a glow so bright it seemed to pierce the fabric like paper. Probably a helicopter, Chris offered, though his voice betrayed doubt. We unzipped the tent in a frenzy and scrambled out, nearly colliding in our haste. The light hung in the sky above the valley, too low for an airplane and too steady for a helicopter, resembling a miniature sun suspended in the night. "Holy shit," Jake whispered. None of us moved or even breathed. The light just hovered as if it were watching us. After what felt like an eternity, though in reality probably only 30 minutes, it began to move, not like an aircraft, but with a smooth, deliberate glide, as if sliding down a window. It descended into the valley, its glow illuminating the mountainside and casting long, eerie shadows through the trees. We'd like to say we acted with bravery, but in truth, we didn't. We resorted to cursing in terror, our voices cracking with a mix of fear and forced bravado. Jake and Marcus even grabbed BB guns from the tent, as if they could do any harm, and started waving them, while Chris shouted, "Get out of here, we see you!" The light paused again, suspended perhaps 1,000 feet above the valley floor. For another half hour we stood there, panic slowly giving way to a morbid fascination. And then it happened. The light split into 2 flawless spheres, as smooth as if undergoing cell division under a microscope. For a moment, they hung there, identical and radiant, before each developed a blue, flame-like aura, reminiscent of St. Elmo's fire, yet with a deliberate intensity. In an instant, they darted off in opposite directions, leaving trails of blue light etched into our retinas, one headed east toward higher peaks, the other west toward the Great Salt Lake. And then they vanished, leaving us in darkness so complete it felt like blindness. None of us slept that night. We huddled in the tent, jumping at every sound, with our BB guns clutched in hand even though we knew they were useless. By sunrise, we tried to rationalize what we'd seen, Perhaps a military test or a rich person's drone, anything that would restore our sense of control. Yet, for the following week, those lights reappeared every night, moving through the mountains like defiant stars that refused to obey astronomical rules. Sometimes they danced together, sometimes they hovered motionless, and on one occasion I distinctly saw 3 of them forming a perfect triangle above the highest peak. We never told our parents or reported the incident. Who would believe 4 teenagers? In Utah County, you learn quickly that some stories are better left unsaid. Years have passed since that night. Jake moved to California for college, Marcus joined the Air Force, and Chris became an accountant in Salt Lake City. We rarely discuss that night, even when we reunite. Yet sometimes when driving through the valley late at night, I see strange lights in the mountains that seem off. Just last week, my 16-year-old nephew asked to borrow my camping gear for a trip to those very mountains. I agreed on the condition he brings a good flashlight. Not to chase away the dark, but to signal back in case those lights are still watching. Because here's the secret we never admitted. Just before those lights split and dashed away that night, they arranged themselves into a pattern. The same pattern we had inadvertently created with our flashlights earlier. They had been watching us long before we even noticed. I still dream of that night, the sight of perfect spheres dividing like cells, and I wonder, what if they weren't leaving at all, but multiplying? Redditor 6. New Mexico's highways can be hypnotic if you're not careful. Endless roads carved through red earth and scrubland, heat waves dancing on the horizon, and a sky so vast and blue it almost seems artificial. I'd driven this stretch of I-40 countless times, but that day in June 2018 was different. That was the day I nearly encountered aliens. Almost. I was heading east from Albuquerque to Amarillo for a sales conference, my car loaded with sample products and promotional materials. The radio had long since given up, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the steady hum of tires on asphalt. That's when I first noticed a perfect chrome sphere suspended in a cloudless sky. At first, I assumed it was merely a reflection, sunlight bouncing off something like my watch or phone. But when I moved and checked my phone's position, the sphere remained fixed about 5 miles away. It looked solid, metallic, catching sunlight like a massive ball bearing floating in space. I blinked repeatedly, but it persisted. "No way," I murmured, tightening my grip on the steering wheel. I had spent my entire life in New Mexico, hearing all the stories, Roswell, Socorro, the Aztec incident, and I'd once dismissed UFO enthusiasts and alien trinkets. Yet here I was, witnessing something that could only be described as an unidentified flying object tailing my car in broad daylight. My mind raced through possibilities: a drone, an experimental craft, or perhaps an optical illusion. Yet drones aren't perfect spheres, military vehicles usually have visible propulsion, and optical illusions don't remain fixed relative to a moving car for 20 minutes. My heart pounded. This was my moment. All those hours spent watching documentaries about close encounters and reading late-night Reddit threads about government cover-ups had led to this singular experience. I, David Martinez, an ordinary medical supply salesman from Albuquerque, was on the brink of making history. When the next rest stop appeared, I signaled carefully and pulled over, determined not to startle what I assumed was my extraterrestrial follower. My hands trembled as I reached for my phone to capture what I believed would be the clearest UFO photo ever taken. Stepping out into the oppressive June heat, I saw the sphere still gleaming against the deep blue sky. I held my breath, snapped photo after photo, each click a prayer for evidence. A pickup truck roared by, its driver giving me a puzzled look. I must have looked absurd, a man in a wrinkled shirt and tie photographing the sky by the roadside. But I was lost in the moment, convinced I was capturing history. Back in the car, I struggled to focus on driving. The sphere continued to pace me for another 10 miles before disappearing behind distant hills. I spent the rest of the drive rehearsing my future story. Should I contact local news first or go straight to national media? MUFON? Would the men in black show up at my door? When I reached my hotel in Amarillo, I hurriedly transferred the photos to my laptop, my hands still shaking. Then I opened the first image. My heart sank. At normal size, it looked promising, a metallic dot against the blue, but zooming in revealed every detail: the slightly elongated bottom, the tether point, the distinctive texture that any meteorologist would immediately recognize. The perfect chrome sphere that had followed me, the vessel I had imagined as otherworldly, was nothing more than a weather balloon, completely ordinary, entirely terrestrial. I sat there in stunned silence, laughing at myself. All those imagined headlines, rehearsed interviews, and dreams of fame had been deflated as easily as a balloon. The next morning, while setting up my booth at the conference, another vendor asked if I'd had an exciting drive. "Uneventful," I replied, "just the usual."
Yet that day taught me something important. For 20 minutes, I had lived in a world where the extraordinary could shatter the mundane. Even though I now know it was a weather balloon, I still miss that electrifying moment when the ordinary cracked open to reveal a glimpse of the impossible.
I still drive that stretch of I-40 for work, and sometimes I find myself scanning the sky, half hoping for another chrome sphere. Not because I expect aliens this time, but because I miss that surge of wonder, the brief instant when the world seemed to reveal its hidden mysteries. Just last week, while driving, I caught sight of a strange light moving in inexplicable ways. For a moment, my heart raced again, but this time, I didn't stop or take photos. I simply watched until it vanished behind the hills, content to let it remain a mystery. Because perhaps what we truly need isn't irrefutable proof of alien life or secret government projects, but those fleeting moments when the ordinary world shatters to reveal a glimpse of the extraordinary. When we look up and think, maybe, just maybe.
So if you ever find yourself driving through eastern New Mexico on a clear day and spot something unusual against the endless blue, let yourself wonder. Snap a photo, imagine the headlines, and feel your heart race at the possibility of discovery. P.S. I eventually posted one of the photos on Reddit. It got a dozen upvotes and a comment pointing out it was clearly a weather balloon. Sometimes reality is less fascinating than our dreams, but that moment of wonder remains unforgettable. Redditor7. I should have never taken that summer security job at Edwards Air Force Base. The pay was good, better than most college gigs, but some experiences aren't worth any amount of money. What I saw during those midnight shifts still haunts me, especially on nights when the moon hangs low over the desert like it did back then. Growing up in Lancaster, just a few miles from the base, everyone knew about Edwards, the sonic booms from test flights shaking our windows at odd hours. But we also knew of Boron, the small town lying in Edwards' shadow, where local lore was filled with whispered tales of what really went on at the base, stories passed down at high school parties and late-night diners. In my senior year, I did a ride-along with the base police as part of a school program. That experience planted seeds of curiosity in me. The officers recounted strange occurrences: underground hangars beneath dry lake beds, experimental aircraft defying physics, and even a secret base within a base that no one was allowed to enter.
One detail stuck with me. During certain fire emergencies, firefighters were instructed to remain outside the gates and merely watch the building burn. I laughed then, but now those words chill me. 5 years later, I returned to Edwards, this time with a security clearance and a night shift position along the outer perimeter. The job was simple enough: monitor surveillance cameras, conduct hourly patrols, and report anything out of the ordinary. Yet at Edwards, unusual became a fluid concept. My first month was uneventful, the desert nights quiet except for the occasional coyote or the distant hum of routine aircraft. But in my 6th week, on a moonless Tuesday night, everything changed.
I was on my 2 a.m. patrol along the eastern perimeter where the base met the vast dry lake bed. During a routine radio check-in, I noticed a light deep in the lake bed where no light should be. It wasn't the bright white of landing lights or the red of warning beacons. This was a pale blue glow, pulsing rhythmically as if emanating from beneath the cracked earth. I switched off my vehicle's lights and watched intently. The glow intensified, pulsing like a heartbeat, and seemed to be moving, or rather rising, Protocol dictated that I report any unusual activity immediately, but something held me back. Perhaps curiosity or the echo of old ride-along stories. I drove closer, keeping my lights off. As I neared, the air transformed. The arid desert heat gave way to a static charge that raised every hair on my arms. Suddenly, my radio burst into a cascade of white noise that grew louder as I approached the source. Amid the static, I could just make out voices speaking urgently, though their words were unintelligible. Then I saw them, figures moving around the source of the light. They weren't in standard Air Force uniforms, nor in the hazmat suits I'd occasionally seen. Their suits were otherworldly, shifting and rippling like liquid metal in the pale blue glow. I reached for my phone to take a picture, but it was dead, completely unresponsive. Meanwhile, the dashboard instruments in my vehicle went haywire, the gauges spinning wildly, and the engine stalled, leaving me stranded about 100 yards from the scene. Without warning, an ear-splitting whine filled the air, building to an almost unbearable pitch. The blue light brightened dramatically, forcing me to shield my eyes. When I looked again, something colossal was emerging from the lake bed. The dry surface cracked and shifted like broken ice, and from the fissures, an indescribable shape began to rise, its form folding in on itself in defiance of all known geometry. At that moment, my radio cleared, and a crisp, authoritative voice commanded, Delta 7, return to base immediately. Repeat, Delta 7, return to base immediately. Confirm receipt. My hands were shaking as I restarted my vehicle, which inexplicably roared back to life. Glancing in my rearview mirror, I saw the figures in their shifting suits watching me, and above them, the impossible shape now loomed as tall as a 10-story building. I broke every speed limit on my way back to the main security office. When I arrived, my supervisor awaited me with two men in black suits I'd never seen. They confiscated my security badge, had me sign a stack of non-disclosure agreements, and informed me that my employment was terminated, effective immediately. Before I left, my supervisor pulled me aside and whispered, "Whatever you think you saw out there, you didn't. And if you did, keep it to yourself. Some fires are best left to burn." That was 3 years ago. Now I'm back in Lancaster working at my uncle's auto shop. Sometimes late at night, I still hear sonic booms, though I now know they're not all from sanctioned aircraft. And when I drive past Boron in the dead of night, I can almost feel that same static charge raising the hairs on my arms. I've never shared this account before, partly due to those NDAs, but mostly out of fear of what might happen if the wrong people learn I'm talking. Lately, however, I've been noticing more strange lights and eerie sounds. Whatever they're testing out there is clearly intensifying. And sometimes, on the quietest nights, I hear a high-pitched whine across the desert, and I wonder what else is waiting to emerge from beneath that dry lake bed. Predatory 8. I once believed amateur astronomy was the epitome of tranquility. Just me, my telescope, and the vast, empty cosmos. No deadlines, no drama. Only the silent companionship of distant stars. That was before I began witnessing things that defied explanation. Before the lights started trailing me home. It started on a Tuesday night in October. The air had that crisp autumn chill that makes stargazing a delight rather than a challenge. I had just finished calibrating my new Celestron telescope, a splurge I'd justified as an early Christmas gift, and was focusing on the lunar terminator, where light and shadow met on the cratered surface, each ridge and valley sharply defined. When I stepped back from the eyepiece to check an astronomy app on my phone, something caught my peripheral vision. A tiny, moving pinpoint of light streaking across the sky. I assumed it was just another satellite, making a mental note to verify its path later, but then it did something impossible. The light halted abruptly, completely stationary as if it had hit an invisible wall. Then, without warning, it turned, a perfect 90-degree shift, as if space itself had been folded like origami. My hands began to shake as I fumbled for my phone to record the phenomenon, but by the time the camera was open, it had vanished. I tried to dismiss it as an optical illusion, a trick of the light, or an odd atmospheric effect born of long hours peering through the telescope. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that what I saw was fundamentally wrong. like watching a fish inexplicably attempt to walk on dry land. A week later, while walking my German Shepherd, Max, on our usual late night route, our ritual of one last cigarette under the stars before bed, I saw it again. At first, it resembled any ordinary satellite, a steady point of light moving across the sky. But as I watched, its movement became erratic. It wobbled like a top, teetering on the verge of falling, then jerked and stalled abruptly. No natural or human made object moves like that. I forgot my cigarette as the light danced overhead, forming deliberate patterns that defied explanation. Max began to whine, a low, unfamiliar sound. When I looked down, I saw him with his ears pinned back, both of us transfixed on the same patch of sky. The light continued its impossible ballet until it neared a particularly bright star, then vanished suddenly, as if snuffed out like a candle. That's when the dream started. Every night, the same sequence. I'd peer through my telescope only to find an eye staring back at me. It wasn't a human eye. The pupil was oddly shaped, like a vertical slit. Sometimes I'd try to pull away from the eyepiece, but my body wouldn't obey. Sometimes, when the eye blinked, I'd wake up drenched in sweat. I eventually stopped using the telescope, though it made little difference. The lights seemed to follow me, flashing by on my way to work, performing impossible aerial ballets above the morning traffic. No one else ever appeared to notice them, or if they did, they chose to ignore it. Was I the only one seeing these anomalies? Last night, however, was different. I was taking out the trash when a light appeared unusually low in the sky. This time it wasn't merely a light at all. It looked like a hole in the fabric of the night, a window into somewhere else. And something was peering through that window. I dropped the trash bag and rushed inside, but not before I heard it, a sound that blended radio static with a haunting, almost musical quality, forming words. We've been watching too. Now, as I write this, I'm trying to piece together what's happening. My telescope remains locked in its case, covered with a sheet in the corner. Sometimes I think I hear it humming softly, as though it's calling to me, or perhaps something is speaking through it. Max no longer goes near that corner. He sits by the window, staring at the sky with an intensity that sends chills down my spine. Occasionally, his ears twitch at something I can't hear. What unsettles me most is that I've begun to notice patterns among the stars, movements that defy normal astronomical behavior, as if the cosmos itself were subtly rearranging. It feels like we're caught in a vast net being slowly drawn tight. I've tried discussing these experiences online with other amateur astronomers, but my posts keep disappearing. The few replies I do receive seem off, like they're penned by something masquerading as human, yet missing key details. Tonight, the lights have returned, drawing intricate geometric shapes across the sky above my home, searing themselves into my memory even after my eyes close. I suspect they're trying to tell me something, or perhaps show me something. I've considered discarding my telescope or moving to a place where light pollution obscures the stars, but I know that wouldn't help, because now it feels as though they've noticed me, and they're not likely to let me look away. So I continue to watch, to document. Maybe someone else out there sees what I see. Maybe they've uncovered the meaning behind these phenomena. Just a word of caution, if you own a telescope, think twice before pointing it at the sky. Some things in the universe clearly prefer not to be observed, and sometimes when you gaze up at the stars, it almost feels as if they're gazing back. Redditor 9CHW Guy Tone usually meant long, uneventful nights punctuated by the occasional inebriated soldier trying to sneak past curfew. That's why the night of 82 remains seared in my memory. It was the first time I saw true terror in a fellow soldier's eyes. Jack and Sarah had left shortly after sunset to see Tron in St. John, a roughly 1 hour drive filled with excited chatter as they set off in Jack's once pristine blue Chevrolet. I waved them off from my post, still hearing Sarah's laughter as they drove away. The night shift settled into its routine. I did my rounds and sipped a cup of coffee when suddenly I heard tires screeching on asphalt. The clock read 9:43 p.m., far too early for a return. The car that pulled up was hardly recognizable as Jack's anymore. Its once immaculate paint was now a chaotic blend of red, green, white, and black, as if it had been caught in a demolition derby. The passenger mirror dangled by its wires, and the front bumper was crumpled beyond repair. Yet it wasn't the wrecked car that froze me, it was the look on Jack and Sarah's faces. Jack's knuckles were white as he gripped the steering wheel, and Sarah sat motionless, her makeup streaked with tears. When I asked what had happened, Jack mumbled something about taking Sarah home, and then they left as if in a daze, leaving the damaged car as silent evidence of an unexplainable event. For 3 days, Jack avoided me. He reported for duty, did his work, but whenever anyone tried to ask about that night, he would vanish. Finally, after sharing half a bottle of whiskey in my quarters, he confided everything. They'd been driving along Route 7, an isolated stretch lined by pine trees and enveloped in darkness. Still about 20 minutes from the movie theater, they rounded a bend and saw strange, colorful lights on a hillside. A small parking lot for hikers marked by an arrow-shaped sign at its entrance. They weren't alone. Several other cars had pulled in, and their occupants gathered in clusters, pointing up at the hill. Jack felt inexplicably drawn toward the spectacle, as did everyone else, and they all began walking toward the trail leading uphill. Then it appeared. It was as if a spotlight had been switched on inside my brain, Jack recalled, his voice trembling as he reached for his drink. But the light wasn't descending from the sky, it was emanating from this disc, hovering over the hill. And the sound, it was like 1,000 dentist drills screaming at once. Chaos ensued. Everyone bolted for their vehicles, but the parking lot had only one narrow exit. Cars collided in the frantic escape, paint scraped, mirrors shattered, metal clashing. And Jack said he'd never seen such panic, not in basic training nor during combat exercises. They made it back to base in record time, with the car pushed to its limits. Jack wouldn't reveal more that night, but a week later he took me to the parking lot. There, amidst scattered fragments of metal, glass, and rubber, lay undeniable proof that something inexplicable had occurred. Then the men in black arrived. They came in a sleek black Lincoln Continental with government plates, though not from any agency I recognized. 2 of them went straight to Jack's quarters, and he was detained for 3 hours. When he emerged, he looked as if he'd aged a decade. At the mess hall that evening, I cautiously asked him, what did they want? He looked around before whispering, listen carefully. If you value your career, if you value your life, never mention what you saw. That night must never be spoken of. Soon after, Jack requested a transfer. Sarah broke up with him before he left, and last I heard, he was stationed somewhere in the Arctic, far from New Brunswick. Sometimes, on late shifts, I find myself gazing at that stretch of highway, visible from the base's north tower. On clear nights, you can see the hill where it all happened. I've never witnessed any strange lights there myself, but I've noticed that the hiking trail is long abandoned. The parking lot has been sealed off with concrete barriers. Every now and then, travelers passing through share tales of mysterious lights in the hills, of missing time, of men in black suits asking unsettling questions. I keep quiet when I hear these stories. Some secrets are best left untold, some nights unremembered. I still keep a small piece of chrome from that night hidden in my footlocker, a silent reminder that what happened wasn't a dream, that somewhere above those New Brunswick hills, something is watching, and sometimes it seems it does more than just watch.